Now, let's be clear about who has been empowered by this election. This is another piece from the New York Times over the weekend. The alt-right exalts in Donald Trump's election with a salute. Hail victory. This is also trending on Twitter, at least as of this morning. Quoting now from the piece. By the time Richard B. Spencer, the leading ideologue of the alt-right movement and the final speaker of the night, rose to address a gathering of his followers, the Saturday crowd was restless. In 11 hours of speeches and panel discussions in a federal building named after Ronald Reagan, a few blocks from the White House, a succession of speakers had laid out a harsh vision of the future, but had denounced violence and said that Hispanic citizens and black Americans had nothing to fear. Earlier in the day, Mr. Spence had urged his group to start acting less like an underground organization and more like the establishment, but now his tone changed. He began to tell the audience of more than 200 people, mostly young men, had been waiting to hear. He railed against Jews and with a smile quoted Nazi propaganda in the original German. America, he said, belonged to white people whom he called children of the sun, a race of conquerors and creators who had been marginalized, but now in the era of President-elect Donald J. Trump were, quote-unquote, awakening to their own identity. It's probably fair to say, and other people have pointed out, that there are three basic components of this quote-unquote alt-right business. We could just call it neo-fascism. We could just call it neo-Dixiecrat. We can just call it the danger zone of emboldened losers. But there is this, represented by Richard Spencer, and it's absolute neo-Nazi bigotry, racism, the likes of which that has not been this overtly promoted in American culture, at least in mainstream American culture, in the very recent past. Although, again, 1990s, Andrew Sullivan thought it was very important that Charles Murray's white racist bell curve nonsense was published in the pages of the New Republic. So again, nothing new under the sun here. Then you have a weird collection of bizarre sort of movements online that congregate around video games, that congregate around sort of sexual frustration. And I'm not saying that to be snarky. It's true. And then you have...
If you notice the Sig Hail that the three people, including Tila Tequila, gave in that picture that came out, you'll notice that the middle guy is doing the famous hover hands technique where men take a picture with a woman but are afraid to put their hand on them. Just speaking of being afraid of women, Nazis are afraid of women.
Nazis are afraid of everything. And number three, the culture of conspiracy and disinformation as exemplified by Alex Jones. Now, Scott Atran, who is an anthropologist who studied why young men are drawn to terrorism and wrote a really important book called Talking to the Enemy. I wanted to actually talk with him about the next phase of understanding ISIS and Al-Qaeda and that security threat. Now I'd like to actually interview him to talk about young men drawn to these movements. He talks about a culture of sort of meaninglessness in late-stage capitalism, humiliation in some cases, and repression in other cases. Now, obviously, that's much clearer and easier to, and just true if you're from a North African or Middle Eastern background. But I do think if we started treating these online systems, and a woman in The Guardian wrote a couple weeks ago about this as well. Forget her name. I need to find that article. We need to start thinking of these systems of neo-fascism online in a similar way to the way we think of ecosystems around ISIS and other forms of terrorism. What is it in this sort of quest for meaning and sense of alienation that's being spoken to? Now, again, in some ways, obviously, if you're from a country that has been colonized or you're experiencing, racial or religious discrimination, it's very obvious. In this case, it's a lot of people who have actually tremendous social, cultural, and even economic privilege, but they have conflated their emotional, sexual damage with political repression to very dangerous results. And we need to start looking in those subcultures as well.
Hey, it's Sam Seder. Why don't you subscribe to this channel? You can do so right over here. Over. Subscribe.